I often start my speeches in this place with a brief reflection on the Coalition's track record whilst we were in government. Not because I want to reminisce on the glory days of when I was sitting in that chair, for example. I do it because I want to remind members and those watching that the Coalition delivered. The Coalition did take action on climate change. We support real action. But we didn't just speak about it. We got on with the job. We're not just an opposition shouting out, making promises, arguing for argument's sake. We had a plan. We delivered on that plan. The safeguard mechanism, Mr Deputy Speaker, was our policy. It was a core part of that plan to drive down emissions while backing innovative technologies. We will support the government in delivering on a balanced approach to reducing emissions, addressing pollution and ensuring Australia remains a strong, prosperous and independent nation. But unfortunately, this bill does no such thing. Mr Deputy Speaker, our balanced plan delivered real action on climate change because we are the party of direct environmental action. We are the party of the National Heritage Trust. We are the party of water security, land care and clean energy technologies. Those opposites so often shout, interject and browbeat about the Coalition's environmental record, but the facts speak for themselves. After 9 years in office, we grew our economy by 23%. 23% we grew the economy in the face of natural disasters, COVID-19 and an economic crisis. At the same time, we left office on track to exceed our 2030 Paris target, headed for a reduction in emissions between 30 and 35%. Now, that was better than Canada, it was better than Japan, it was better than New Zealand, and it was better than the United States. Australia led the way on the 2020 Kyoto targets, beating it by more than 459 million tonnes. We reduced 20% of emissions on our 2005 base level, and we were headed towards net zero by 2050. In our last 5 years of government alone, we invested $40 billion into renewable energy, with renewables now making up 1/3 of Australia's energy generation. This led to the creation of as many as 160,000 jobs. We supported over 6,900 clean energy projects in Queensland through the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. In 2021, we installed 6.1 gigawatts of renewable capacity, more than in the entire term of the previous Labor government. Let me say that again in case you missed it, Mr Deputy Speaker. And for those opposite, in 2021 we installed 6.1 gigawatts of renewable capacity, more than in the entire term of the previous Labor government. And nearly 1 in 3 homes, of course, have photovoltaic cells on their roof, the world's highest rate of solar rooftop panels. Now, while Labor denigrated our farmers and our miners, we actually delivered on renewable energy. We invested $250 million into recycling modernisation and $3 billion into the Great Barrier Reef protection. We introduced the Threatened Species Strategy. We positioned Australia to be a true leader in Antarctic stewardship, science and security. We rolled out $52 million in digital environment assessment system. We invested $590 million into biosecurity measures and $200 million into the Environmental Restoration Fund. We balanced historic economic growth with record emissions reduction and environmental action. You really can, Mr Deputy Speaker, have the best of both worlds. And we did it without taxes. Our agenda was simply put, technology, not taxes, progress, not platitudes. We wanted measurable progress on emissions reduction without giving families and their businesses the bill. And we got on with the job and we delivered, because that is what good governments do. They set a target and they achieve it. They've chosen to reject a balanced approach, and Australian families and their businesses are now paying the price. Labor proposed to price carbon dioxide at $75 a tonne. Australia will have a price that is 3 times higher than the one set by the previous Labor government, and it is set to rise to $100 by 2030. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, let's not be mistaken about this. This is a carbon tax dressed in the garb of a safeguard mechanism. It's just another attempt to dismantle good coalition policy. After a decade of balancing emissions reduction with economic growth, Labor is now rushing to impose drastic cuts on Australian businesses. The safeguard mechanism has been working well for years as a system to cap emissions whilst the economy has grown. But Labor cannot help themselves. They're now changing the purpose of the scheme from one that stops emissions by encouraging businesses and backs technology to a scheme that punishes businesses and imposes more and more taxes. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's as if they want to make Australian businesses uncompetitive. It's as if they want Australian businesses to become unviable. And this Labor government had the audacity to claim that industry supports this policy. This same federal Labor government claimed that industry supported its reckless and unprecedented industrial relations reforms because they attended the Job Summit it slapped together in 2022. Do you remember that? The Job Summit? You don't hear him talking about that much anymore, do you? The fact is that many, if not all, of the industries covered by the safeguard mechanism have strong concerns about many aspects of this Labor's policy. Key Australian industries are incredibly worried. Think about critical mineral resources like copper, coal, gas and iron ore. We are world leaders in clean minerals processing. I know you know this, Mr Deputy Speaker. And yet Labor want to dissuade investors and send them elsewhere. Most of our competitors do not have any national carbon pricing scheme in place at all. Just think about that. What cruel government would squander Australia's natural competitive advantage by taxing hard-working Australians and their employers? What strange, self-sabotaging government would surrender one of Australia's core economic strengths and discourage global investment? I'll give you a hint. It's those members on that side, Mr Deputy Speaker. Producers of cement, steel and aluminium, large employers once again have been ignored by Labor. Their ignorance, their incompetence and indifference in pursuit of this policy will drive up the cost of construction and manufacturing. On the Sunshine Coast, construction accounts for 18,123 jobs. It's about 12.5% of the local workforce. It has a value add of around $1.9 billion to our local economy. And manufacturing accounts for 8,024 jobs, or 5.5% of the labour force. It has a value add of around $890 million to our economy. These are crucial sectors for employment and economic growth on the Sunshine Coast, and Labor's failure to address the cost of living crisis, as well as its obsession with red tape and wacky climate policies, is going to cost many in my community their livelihoods. Now, think, Mr Deputy Speaker, about rail and transport. Think about the logistics. Think about utilities and infrastructure development. Think about agriculture, forestry and fishing, retail, healthcare and technology. It's all of these industries that are going to suffer. It's not just the mining and energy sectors at risk of Labor's poorly packaged red tape or green tape that we're debating here today. Labor's sneaky carbon tax will affect almost every industry, every household and every Australian. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, perhaps most egregiously, they've put this policy on the table without any modelling. Now, I know if people are listening to this, they're thinking, nah, surely they haven't introduced this policy without any modelling, to see what sort of damage this is going to cause to the economy. Those opposite make bold and untested promises to gain power, and then they present half-baked policy experiments to the Australian people, hoping that feel-good photo ops distract them. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, recently in Senate estimates, it was confirmed there that the government has not undertaken any assessments of impacts of this policy. The government has not analysed how some of these most severe emissions reduction targets, the most severe in the world, will deliver Labor's aspirations of a 30% reduction by 2030. Labor did not model the economic impacts of its policy on investment, on jobs and on household budgets. And let's not be mistaken, it will be Australian households who will pay the price. And that is happening now. In question time, the Minister for Energy was trying to argue that those opposite, the government, by virtue of the caps that they put in place last year, that Australians should be jumping with joy, that we've never had it so good, because instead of an increase of 50%, they're only paying an additional 30%. Well, you try telling that to the average punter at home. I think the average punter at home will have a very, very different view about what's good for them and what this government says is good for them. Now, let's not be mistaken. As I said, it'll be Australian households who pay the price. There's no modelling of the expanding credit market the government wants to use, no assessment of demand for carbon credits or their price. We do know that if demand for carbon credits exceeds supply, business will be lumped with a penalty of $275 per tonne of CO2. 97 times they promised that power bills would be cut by $275. Now, without warning, they're imposing a $275 per tonne tax onto Australian businesses. In this last-minute climate policy, we have a litany of unanswered questions. Will businesses pay that $275 per tonne? Will they just suck it up and say, oh, no, we won't worry about that, we'll take that off the bottom line? I don't think that's going to happen. We all know that businesses are going to pass that down the line. It'll be consumers that pay the price. And ultimately, it will be businesses that pay the price. Because this policy, make no mistake, will result in businesses having to close their doors because they cannot compete on a world stage. And those members opposite should reflect on that this policy, which has not been costed, has not been modelled, I should say, will close businesses. People will lose their jobs. That will cut emissions. This is a major reform, Mr Deputy Speaker, and Australians deserve to know how it will impact on and their families and their businesses. They deserve to know what impact this will have on the availability, reliability and affordability of their electricity. Labor haven't provided an assessment of how many new safeguard mechanism credits could be created under this legislation. They haven't told us how they'll support trade, exposed industries. Businesses should know whether they can afford to keep their lights on. Instead, Labor is keeping the Australian people in the dark.